right, we're back for another episode. Last week, Laura and I sort of introed this topic and talked a lot around some of the body weight and body image and nutritional challenges and things that we've seen at OGX and seen with our athletes. And so I'm really excited this week to jump more specifically into this with our guests. So Courtney, if you want to introduce yourself to our audience, kind of what's your background, what do you sort of focus on now, and then we can jump in.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, thank you for having me on today. I'm super excited to be here. So I am a registered dietitian. I work specifically with athletes. I have my master's in nutrition. I got my master's in 2022 from the University of Illinois at Chicago. So while I was there, I had the opportunity to work with Northwestern University and their athletics department. So working with their football team and then their women's field hockey team as well, which was an incredible experience. When I was done there, I then moved to Las Vegas and had the opportunity to work at the UFC Performance Institute with all of the combat athletes out there. So again, another really awesome opportunity that I'm super grateful for. Everyone there is really knowledgeable, and I got to learn a lot about all more of like an interdisciplinary approach at both places, really looking at, performance and nutrition, and then strength and conditioning and sports medicine, and kind of even, sports psych too, and how all of those play a role in creating a healthy athlete that's performing at their peak. So once I finished at the UFC, I moved back to Chicago, where I live now, from the Chicago area originally, and started my own private practice, working with athletes and general population of all areas. So really helping people train for marathons or even collegiate athletes and helping them improve their performance, and even professional athletes coming up here, which is really exciting. That's kind of a little bit of me. I do try to focus on more of a diet-free approach when it comes to fueling athletes, because I feel like there's so much information out there around food and which foods are good or bad, or even putting a label on foods being good or bad in general. I think all foods can serve a purpose in some way. And so I think when it comes to the athletic population, I want to just make sure that people who work with me are really fueled to perform at their best and feel their best. And so that's my goal as a practitioner. And I also work with the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee and their athletics department there. So working just one-on-one with some of their athletes there, which has been a really fulfilling experience, because I did get my undergrad degree from there as well. So I'm happy to be back and doing that part-time on the side as well. So yeah, lots of
awesome. Yeah. You mentioned some of the different information out there. And I think obviously you said you were a registered dietitian. I think it would be helpful just, for our families and athletes to understand, maybe if I'm coming across information, whether it's on social media or I'm seeking out help from a nutrition standpoint, whether they're different levels of certification that someone might have that can give you sort of nutritional guidance. Maybe what nutritional guidance can they give you, the different layers. Sometimes we'll have athletes ask our strength coach, what should I be eating? And he'll give a little bit, but he'll say there's limits on how much I can really help you with this. And can you kind of walk through what that looks like from your sort of schooling of the different levels and people that can kind of help from a nutrition standpoint?
Yeah, absolutely. So it is definitely a little confusing because, everybody, especially with the internet, thinks they're a nutrition expert. So in order to become a registered dietitian, you have to go through an accredited program. And now you have to have your master's in order to be a registered dietitian. So I have done both of those things. You have to complete 1,200 supervised practice hours. So that is working underneath a dietitian in various different areas. So there's a food service rotation, there's clinical inpatient and outpatient work that you do. And then there's some other ones too that you can kind of mix in. So after you complete those supervised practice hours, the accredited program, you have your master's, then you're eligible for the RD exam. So then you take a national certifying exam that all dietitians have to take. So once you pass that exam, then you are officially a registered dietitian. Sometimes it varies by state, whether you have to be licensed to practice in the state. So Illinois specifically does have their own licensing laws. So you do have to be licensed to practice in Illinois. Some states are different. I believe they're actually working on a national license, which is going to be awesome and really open up more opportunities for dietitians to practice, via telehealth. Some of the other things that you may see are like nutrition coaches or nutrition certifications that can be obtained through different organizations. So for example, NASM, which I know has like personal training, they also have a like certified nutrition educator, I think is the term, or like the course that they have. So there are different like courses and certifications that someone could get, but that's really just scratching the surface when it comes to nutrition information and nutrition application. Registered dietitians really have the ability to look at someone from like a medical nutrition therapy standpoint, and we have the training and education required to really understand what's going on in the body from, a cellular level even sometimes, and how nutrition can kind of impact some different things that we see. So that's a little bit of the difference between, being a registered dietitian, having maybe like a nutrition certification, which I think is a great stepping stone if someone has a nutrition certification, but they certainly don't have all of like the background and education and training that a registered dietitian has. So when you're seeking information, it's really important to kind of take a look at those things. Many people will call themselves a nutritionist, or even when I started my business, I hadn't gotten my RD yet. So I was a nutrition coach. And, I think that that's fine, but it's also important to look at someone's education and their experience. While I was a nutrition coach, I also had all this other experience and education that I knew, and I knew, what parameters to operate within from a safety standpoint and a legal standpoint as well. Operating as a nutrition coach versus a dietitian, it opens up a lot more doors, but it's important to make sure that you are getting information from a credible source and not someone who's just, I did my research and,
Right.
Giving you information that may not be applicable to you or may not be the correct information as well.
Yeah, I think that's great because obviously we get so much information now, and sometimes we can either be led astray, or it can, like you said, I think even more importantly, it's a lot of time maybe it is well-meaning, but there's limitations to what that person might be able to serve for you. And so just understanding the different sources of information, that you're getting and what the limitations might be on that person's knowledge, I think is really important. So, all right, we talked, Laura and I got into it last episode about some of the challenges we've seen, but I think maybe if you can just start with an overview of, in your experience with athletes, what are some of the what are the big overarching sort of nutritional challenges that you see that maybe, with your work at the universities, you guys were trying to fill, for these athletes? What are some of the big challenges that athletes face regularly from a nutritional standpoint, from your standpoint?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the biggest, I would say, number one thing that I see is just athletes not eating enough. I think it's really hard, especially at the university level and even at the high school level too. You have school, you have practice, you have extra training. When you're in season or out season, like your schedule is jam-packed all the time. And so I think that presents some additional challenges when it comes to fueling. But overall, the biggest thing that I have seen is athletes not eating enough, and then also not eating enough of the right foods. We talked a little bit about, how there is so much information out there. And I think there's such a big emphasis on protein, which like, yes, protein is important, but I think for athletes specifically, a lot of times they're not getting enough carbohydrates because that's, what your body wants to use as its main source of fuel. And I think with, the fear that's put around sugar and added sugars and these types of things, it really puts a lot of stress on some individuals when it comes to meal times of like, okay, I have to have a ton of protein, but I also need to make sure I'm not eating all of these added sugars and low carb. Like those are a lot of the things that I see. So what I tried to do is just educate, like that's a huge part of it of like, you need carbohydrates to be a high performing athlete. Like point in case, that's what is really going to be fueling your body to do the work that you're asking it to do. And so I would say those are probably like the two biggest things that I see when it comes to, athletes at the collegiate level, high school level. That's a lot of what I work on with them.
Yeah. And not that that was a trick question, but like literally the whole episode last time was about basically how often we see athletes underfueled. So I think it's pretty obvious that this is the trend for athletes for a variety of reasons of just not understanding how much to eat. So on that, without diving into everything, obviously this is going to have to be high level. It's just a podcast episode, but how do athletes know as an athlete what amounts they should be eating? What are some things that they should look for to sort of determine on a daily basis what is the amount of fuel I should be intaking?
Yeah, definitely. I think, again, it can be really detailed, and I try not to really give specific calorie amounts because at the end of the day, whether you're eating like 500 calories for a meal or, 400, it's all going to kind of balance out at the end. So I think one kind of key thing to focus on is making sure that they're at least getting 3 meals and like 1 to 2 snacks a day. A lot of people that I have worked with aren't getting 3 meals. They're maybe getting a snack. And again, like the contents of that is not always where we want it to be in terms of like carbohydrates to protein to, some veggies and color on that plate. So I think, trying to make sure that you are getting at least 3 meals, spreading that protein intake out throughout the day. Of course, protein is important. It helps your muscles repair and continue to build. But trying to make sure that you're spreading it out throughout the day. I've also seen individuals, having a massive amount, something like 90 grams of protein. And I've seen like some of these videos online too, where they're like, 300 grams of protein in a day. And I'm like, that's just like too much. Like you don't need that much.
Yeah.
So, trying to spread it out throughout the day. Our bodies go through muscle protein synthesis. And so research shows that it's best to have, 20 to 30 grams of protein spread throughout the day. So if you look at like the size of your palm or a deck of cards and trying to make sure that you're getting at least that much protein at each meal. Those kind of visuals, I think, is a little bit more helpful than, 20 grams, because can be kind of like an arbitrary number for some people. And they're like, I don't really know what that means. And we don't use really grams in the US anyway. So I think it can get a little confusing. So yeah, trying to make sure they're spreading the protein throughout the day, getting some type of carbohydrates on their plate at each meal. If you can, making, half of those carbohydrates whole grains. So doing, like whole wheat bread or brown rice or whole wheat pasta, like those types of things. And then, of course, everybody's least favorite thing, trying to incorporate some more vegetables and produce in there. A lot of people really aren't meeting their fiber needs. So trying to incorporate as many of those as possible. I think one time I had posted a video on Instagram about, like incorporating more fiber and more whole grain foods. And like I had just mentioned, and someone was like, oh, Americans think that more fiber comes from eating more whole grains. And I'm like, that's not what I'm saying. Like it's also coming from vegetables and fruit and, nuts and seeds and those kinds of things too. So yeah.
Yeah.
So getting 3 meals a day and then incorporating some of those snacks as well.
Yeah. not again. And if you want very specific advice, go to Courtney and you can get all the specific advice you want. So we're going to try to keep it as high level as we can. But we're in season right now for our high school athletes. And so we like laid out, this was such a good exercise, but when we were going through like the challenges our athletes are facing during this time period, we laid out like an actual schedule of an athlete in that day. So, we have athletes, they go to school between 7 and 8. A lot of times their lunch at school is at like 10:30. There's some like weird hour, like they can get the weird hour of lunch. And then, they get off at 2:30. They have enough time to switch to go to practice or game. And then sometimes they go to something after that, or they have an activity, but they finish their game and they either have homework or another activity, and then they go to bed. So given kind of those parameters, what are some things that you would say, like, without getting, again, into every single specific, but, we would try to eat this, or here's where we maybe would fill in a snack. Like, I really am thinking, okay, the obvious example would be eat breakfast before you go. You're going to eat lunch. Like, maybe that, what might I think about bringing for lunch as a high school athlete? And then what do I eat? Like, what should I pack or think about bringing pre-game or practice? Because I think a lot of times that's one of the biggest challenges. And then maybe assuming that their, dinner is this post-activity food, kind of like what they might do during that time period.
Yeah. I know, I remember that high school early lunch was always tough. Like,
It's such a thing
like
at
10:30 a.m. or something crazy.
Yeah.
Which is, for an athlete is not really ideal, because then you have this big window from like 10 to whatever, 2:30 or 3 when they're done with school. How do you fill that gap? So if possible, having some type of snack in between lunch and, finishing school would be great, whether it's, like some beef jerky with a granola bar, or even like a Gatorade or a protein shake with, a granola bar, some dried fruit, like trail mix. Those are all really like easy options that can, kind of be eaten quickly. We don't want to be like scarfing our food down all the time, but sometimes that's what has to happen just to make sure we're, meeting our needs. So, getting, if possible, a snack in between there. Maybe it's in between classes. When you're done with school, before training, before practice, some things that I think are easy to incorporate would be something like an Uncrustable. Some people are going to be different when it comes to fueling before training. Just from like a GI perspective, some people, it's harder for them to eat right before training than others. So if you feel like that's you and you're someone that you're like, I can't eat before working out, like I feel like I'm going to throw up, like start simple. It doesn't have to be anything crazy. Like that Uncrustable might not be for you. It might be too much. So stick with something liquid, using like a Gatorade or some type of smoothie or 100% fruit juice. Like those are all things that are going to be a little bit easier to digest and going to digest a little bit quicker than having like a full, like big snack or meal, like right before training. So if it's at that like 30 to 60 minute mark, I would say like keep it a little bit lighter, mostly carbohydrates. So again, like leaning on that granola bar, if it's a liquid source that I mentioned previously, anything like crackers or goldfish, pretzels, any of those things that are easy to throw in your bag. They're shelf stable. It's not something you have to worry about like spoiling. Those are all really good options to have right before training. If you can get a little bit more in and get, maybe some like a little extra protein, maybe it's something like a Cliff Bar that has a little bit more protein, or something that has, around 10 to 15 grams of protein with some carbohydrates. But regardless, right before training, that key is going to be those carbohydrates, because we want to make sure we're topping off those energy stores before training. And then, like you said, after practice or whatever, probably most likely having dinner. And then for some individuals, like having a late night snack, you're using your brain to do that homework. And if you're someone who doesn't like waking up early and breakfast is something you really struggle with, like it's okay to have something later at night before bed. Like if you want to have another, like maybe it's a second dinner, like that's totally fine, because we want, again, we want to make sure that we're meeting your energy needs. And if, when you're sleeping, that's a big time when you're recovering. So we want to make sure we're giving your body energy to fully recover from the training and the day that you just had, whatever kind of day you just had. So, especially being in season, I know like schedules can get a little more hectic. So taking any of those windows that we can to fuel is going to be really key to, good performance.
Yeah. I think that we talked about this a little bit in the last episode with Laura too. I think one of the challenges with all of this is it requires some intentionality, but it doesn't have to be super complicated. So I think that that's really important, is like sometimes, and we talked about this a lot, of this like sort of adultification, or taking this like, grown woman trying to keep her body weight down approach to eating. And so it's like, how am I going to pack my salad for my between meal? And so I think it's important, the things you're saying, which is it does require a little bit of planning, put stuff in your bag, but we're talking about granola bars, goldfish, beef jerky, these things that are pretty easy to grab and bring. And I think that that's really important for the athletes to hear, which is this is, it's really doable. It's just going to require just a little bit of thought. So obviously we've talked about athlete challenges generally, and a lot of it, and I think this is a big piece of it, is just around the sort of time constraints. You're basically, there's some period. I think that for some athletes, when you're trying to fuel yourself and you have all of these school and sport and all of this, it feels like every free window you're eating, and that can feel sometimes like a little bit overwhelming. And so there are those challenges for athletes, certainly just in their busy schedules. What are some specific struggles you've seen that apply a little bit more to female athletes that sort of, they struggle with at a different level or in different ways when it comes to their nutrition and their sport?
Yeah, I mean, I think when it comes to the female athlete, obviously menstruation plays a huge role and can impact performance and energy levels. So that alone, I think, has a whole nother factor. When it comes to maybe not feeling enough and missing some of those fueling windows, we can kind of get into that REDS area where, it's consistent decreased energy intake that doesn't meet their performance demands. And so over time, starting to see, more increased injuries, whether it is, muscular or, soft tissue injuries, or even like stress fractures, those types of things. Obviously, that's like more of a progression. Or even, decreases in performance, decreases in recovery, taking a longer time to recover from practice or games or tournaments, more than normal. And sometimes I think that can be hard, that more than normal can be hard, and like obviously varies person to person, especially if it's something that's been going on for a long period of time. You may not know like what is normal, how long should it take me to recover? And again, like that's going to be varied person to person, but those are kind of some of the things. Decreases in strength and power, speed, reaction time, all of those things can kind of start to take a dip when we're not meeting our energy needs through food. Also, even like from a psychological standpoint, increase like anxiety or stress, difficulty concentrating, or even, sleep can play a big role in it. So, obviously I won't talk too much about those things, but they do play a big role too. And, food can really, play a big role in kind of managing some of these things. So I think it just goes back to, again, like making sure we are prioritizing fueling, and that like if you are someone who experiences these things, like take a step back and think like, okay, am I maybe eating enough to meet where my energy needs are? I see that a lot, where it's like I'm really sore, I'm having trouble, like my performance isn't where I want it to be, and the second we start to incorporate just a little few changes, more food, more carbohydrates, like you start to see that performance increase. Again, also with reds, sometimes like menstrual dysfunction, so losing your period or having irregular periods, those can kind of be some signs that something is going on. And I think as a dietitian, it's really frustrating because a lot of times doctors will be like, oh, that's normal. But like losing your period is not normal unless you're, on a birth control where that's a direct symptom of that birth control. That's the only time it's like, okay, yeah, that's what is going to happen. But if you're not on any type of birth control, like you should be having a regular period as a female athlete. And if you're not, then it's a sign that something else is going on. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
I want to get in more to reds in a second, but on a sort of higher level before we dive more into that, do you see differences in when you're working with a male athlete and you're kind of talking through, okay, we need to fuel more, we need to eat these things, and you're working with a female athlete of how it might be received, or sort of like any perception around more fuel or any worries from a like body image standpoint? Like how is that sort of different approach in your experience when you're working with male versus female athletes?
To be very honest, it's kind of similar. I would say, I mean, I know statistically, there's more of a concern in the female athlete population when it comes to body image. But even in male athletes, like I do see concerns around body image and,
Yep.
Well, I don't want to eat too much of this food because I don't want it to change the way I look. And it is a very real thing. And I think, again, like social media and the things messages that we're receiving constantly of like, we need to fit this box, I think proposes like more challenges for athletes, especially because I think like at the high school and collegiate level, you may have friends who are not athletes and they are going to be eating differently than you. And like, that's just because they don't have the same energy demands, so I think when it comes to like approaching those conversations, my goal again is to educate and share that like we want to be taking care of your body. Like this is the only body that you get, and we want to make sure that we're fueling it appropriately and making sure that you are performing at your best. And if there are concerns around, body image, like I do try to address those in a way and just in a curious way. Like, what are your thoughts around that? How do you feel with these things? Because it can be, a little more complex when it comes to that stuff,
Yeah, for sure. Okay. So you mentioned reds. Can you walk through what reds is? Sort of like what is reds? What are the signs of reds? Why does it matter? You got into this a little bit, but why is this something that female athletes need to think through, or that should kind of be on their radar?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So previously we had the female athlete triad. So, menstrual dysfunction, low energy availability, and then like low bone density as well. Reds kind of encompasses all of that and then looks more at just energy deficiency in general. So when I say energy deficiency, specifically like not eating enough. So, your training load may be all the way up here, but then your fueling is all the way down here. And that's where we kind of start to see some of those symptoms of, maybe you're having a harder time recovering, or, you have more fatigue, you're having trouble, making it all the way through your training, or other, like, obviously I mentioned like irregular periods, or, losing it altogether. These can also, like under fueling for a prolonged period of time also will have impacts on hormones and hormone function, which is part of the reason that we lose our period in the first place. So that's kind of some of those like symptoms that maybe you can start looking at. Obviously, like once we get into losing your period and stress fractures and other more, like serious side effects of this, like that's where it's been going on for a longer period of time. So some of like the earlier things maybe would be, like that prolonged recovery time, or soft tissue injuries, just decreases in performance overall, whether it is speed or power, or strength in general, endurance, like those things will all start to take a dip. So if that's something that you're starting to see in yourself, where you're like, oh, I don't feel as strong as I used to, or I'm not as fast as I used to be, those could be cues for you to kind of take a look in, and maybe have a conversation, whether it's with me or someone else, who probably preferably a dietitian, when
Yeah.
you're talking about the red specifically, having those conversations of like, hey, I'm experiencing these, or, even talking to someone you trust, and just having that conversation, I think would be really a good starting point to determining like, okay, what's going on here? Like where are things going wrong that like I'm starting to see these decreases in my performance?
Yeah. And we obviously, I told you a little bit of our backstory, and we talked about this, me and Laura talked about this, but we see irregular periods. I don't know if alarming is the right word, but too high of a percentage of athletes. And as you mentioned, we have experienced very similar things that you have, which many of those athletes have been told that that's normal, that it's normal. And all the way until the point where we have athletes who have stress fractures. Now, these are stress fractures that are common in our sport, things like pars fractures in the back and things that do happen for athletes, unfortunately, as they are young and kind of going through that puberty window, and they're, we have overuse, and we have some things that play into it as well. But we have athletes who are experiencing irregular periods or missed periods and experiencing bone issues, and are still going to the doctor, and they're like, that's just overuse. That's just, it's the normal course of things. So I guess just like to reiterate, and I think it's really important that we continue to help our female athletes advocate that that's not normal, and try to find someone that sort of will go down that journey with you of trying to dive into what is going on, and not tell you that those things are normal. Outside of the bone, the risk of injury and the things that can come from just being depleted that long, and you already are starting to have irregular periods. Let's say that an athlete kind of maintains a performance they're fine with and is having that in its prolonged period of times. Are there longer term ramifications for female athletes to that kind of energy depletion, as far as like, I'm looking ahead to my future, I'm just making decisions based on today, and this feels too hard for me to try to feel more, and this is just kind of what I am, and I'm fine for now? Like, what are the other ramifications that women can see from experiencing something like that for a while?
Yeah, I mean, I think from a long-term perspective, like, let's say you're at the high school level, and yeah, you might be able to push through, through high school, through college, but at a certain point, like, you're gonna hit a wall somewhere, right? Where like, you're not going to be able to push through anymore, whether it's a more severe fracture, or, like something that you're not going to be able to recover for. Female athletes are also at a higher risk for ACL tears, related to like estrogen and progesterone, or estrogen, sorry. And so those types of things too, like, could take you out of your sport. And like, I don't think that's what anybody, like, nobody wants to have a career ending injury, and not that those are career ending, but they're certainly going to play a role there. And then also just having those hormone imbalances for so long is really not something you want, because it's going to take time to recover from that. And those are things that just impact like day-to-day function. And so we really want to try to avoid that for like a very prolonged period of time, because nobody wants to go through any of that stuff, and I know, again, I understand. I was in high school at one point too, and there were times where I was like, I don't care, like, whatever, I'm young, like, I get it. But at the same time, it's like, think about where you want to be from like a performance standpoint, you know, like, especially if you're in high school, like, do you want to go on to play in college? If so, like, there could be scholarships on the line for that. And so we want to make sure that you are performing and like do set these, you know, habits now so that when you get to college, it's a lot easier and you already have this like foundational knowledge of like, okay, well, I know I need to be like eating like this, and then you can make fine-tune adjustments from there. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And I think part of the, you know, a lot of our listeners are coaches and also parents. And I think a lot of this comes down to the parent helping the athlete advocate for herself. Obviously, these are hard conversations. And as a teenager, I mean, some of our athletes, they, you know, just got their first period. They don't know whether it's supposed to be irregular, what it looks like. You know, they need to be educated on these things. So it does come to the parents a lot to kind of advocate for this type of conversation. And I think the more we just keep kind of like screaming from the rooftops that it is not normal to have an irregular period. And I think some of this for us came from, you know, the kind of original definition of this was really tied in these sports where like body weight being low was a key performance metric. So, you know, we referenced gymnastics and long distance running and these sports where women were actively being told, and men in that sport, like, you know, if women wrestled more, I'm sure it would come into play for that, or like these sports that are really about keeping your body weight low or stopping your period intentionally or, you know, stopping puberty almost intentionally in these things. And so that's where some of the definitions around this syndrome, you know, this dysfunction came into play. And so I think a lot of times now, because the sports system that women are in is changing dramatically. We have way more women in very intense and competitive sports, which is amazing. But we're also finding that now that sort of dysfunction or irregularity is coming from a sport like softball that really has nothing to do with being low body weight, you know, keeping those things down. And so we don't have a language to talk about it. And so we've had athletes where they've gone, you know, to the doctor, or they've gone to things, and that's been a question of like, well, you're not in, you know, you're not in these kind of like things that we would anticipate this to happen. And so that's probably not the case for you. And we've like lost the language, I think, to talk about. It's probably just the case now that female athletes are going to deal with this on a different level because they are engaging so much in competitive sports at a very high level. And this is just part of the reality of their body. But yeah, I think it's really important for our listeners to just know, to really push that conversation if someone's telling you it's regular. And yeah, it's not. So if you're having it, go talk to Courtney and talk about what the kind of challenges you might be facing. So kind of to leave our listeners here with maybe some key things that like, okay, I'm a female athlete. I don't have any of the red flags as far as like, I'm not feeling maybe I'm feeling a little tired because my schedule's really busy. I'm struggling to kind of feel like where I would fit things in. What are just like some of the key, if you could check XYZ box, you know, what are some of the key takeaways you think would be just like really good places to start for the more, you know, like I said, if you're facing any of the challenges talked about, which are the bigger challenges, then I think go kind of seeking help would be great. But you're before that and you're trying to figure that out. What are some key takeaways for those people?
Yeah. I mean, I think if you're a female athlete and, you know, you're just kind of going through the motions right now of like, okay, well, I'm not really experiencing anything too intense, but yeah, like you said, maybe I am feeling a little more fatigued. I think just taking a second to check in with yourself of like, okay, what am I, you know, after you've listened to this episode, what am I doing day to day that maybe aligns with some of the things that might be contributing to my lower energy? You know, am I getting enough sleep? Am I eating enough? You know, am I skipping breakfast? Am I skipping lunch and then just going straight into practice? Those are kind of some things to just take a look at. And it doesn't take a lot of time to kind of do a quick check-in with yourself. You know, it can be less than 5 minutes of like, okay, let me think back through my day or my week of like where maybe things may have been missed. So taking a second just to check in with yourself and see like, where am I at right now and how am I feeling with this, can be really helpful. And then also, again, trying to just incorporate some of those really simple snacks. Like, I'm not telling you to go make a gourmet meal every single day. Like, I understand that's not a reality for a lot of people. Like, I am a full supporter of making things as easy as possible. And sometimes that means like using more like quote unquote convenience food. So like utilizing frozen options. Frozen fruits and veggies are a great way to get them in because you don't have to worry about them spoiling. Sometimes they're actually more nutrient dense than their fresh counterparts just because they've been like picked and harvested at their peak freshness and then frozen. So those are great, like super easy to incorporate that way. So yeah, just trying to get some of those like really simple snacks in throughout your day if you can. And then, yeah, also just like trying to, like get as much fuel in as possible, whether it is, liquid sources or those snacks, and increasing your overall meals in general. I think is a great place to start, as well as, making sure you are getting enough carbohydrates on your plate too. So if you're not sure, like if you're that person that's bringing a salad to lunch every day, that's fine. Please keep eating your salad because I want you to have those veggies, but also maybe incorporate, some extra fruit on the side, or, maybe you're bringing a sandwich with you. It could be like a PB&J, something super easy. It doesn't have to be anything crazy. But yeah, just trying to keep it as simple as possible and also not worrying too much about like all of the other diet culture things that we're fed through the internet.
Right.
So yeah.
Yeah. If people want to find you, they have more questions or they're, have an athlete that's interested in working with you, where can they find your information? Obviously, we'll also put it in the show notes and we'll put it in the captions and things when we're sharing these things, but maybe social media handles, things like that.
Yeah. Well, you can follow me on Instagram. My Instagram handle is my first and last name. So you can just copy and paste that into there. So kind of long. And then, yeah, if you're interested in working together, I would say Instagram is the best way to kind of get in touch with me. Just shoot me a DM, honestly, and we can chat more about what you're looking to do and kind of what you might be struggling with. I'm always open to having those conversations or just sharing any information. If you have any questions about anything, my DMs are always open. So yeah, Instagram is the best place for now.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I think this is just such a great conversation and super relevant for our athletes and the things that they deal with. And so I know that people will have great takeaways from today. Like and subscribe the OGX podcast anywhere you listen to your podcast. It helps us and we appreciate it.